Intellunia, 100 Dark Psychology Facts about Power, Control and Human Motivation. Fall asleep while uncovering 100 quietly unsettling truths about influence, control, and the hidden architecture of human behavior. From the subtle shift of power in everyday conversations, to the invisible mechanisms that shape memory and identity, to the deep patterns that govern how we're influenced without ever realizing it, this soft, contemplative bedtime documentary will guide you through the sophisticated machinery of psychological control. Perfect for winding down at night, this sleep-friendly exploration blends calm storytelling with penetrating psychological insight to help your mind slow down and drift into reflective rest. Discover how power operates through silence, why vulnerability can be weaponized, and how the stories we tell ourselves become the cages we inhabit, told in a soothing, measured voice designed for nighttime contemplation. This relaxing bedtime journey is ideal for falling asleep to thought-provoking psychological narration, gentle nighttime learning about human nature and influence, deep reflection on relationships, systems, and awareness, understanding the patterns that shape our choices, sleep-friendly wisdom delivered in calming tones. Includes insights about why power shifts invisibly in every interaction we have, the psychology of manipulation, and how to recognize it, how memory, identity, and reality itself can be reshaped, the mechanisms of control in relationships and institutions, social patterns that perpetuate without anyone choosing them, self-awareness, freedom, and the space between stimulus and response. Subscribe to Intellunia for more soft, penetrating documentaries about psychology, power, and the hidden forces that shape human experience, perfect for learning, reflecting, and understanding the world beneath the surface. There's a moment that happens in every conversation, every negotiation, every human interaction, a moment so subtle that most people never notice it. It's the moment when power shifts from one person to another, invisible as air but unmistakable in its effects. This is the story of how control works, how influence flows through our lives like an underground river, shaping everything we do without us ever seeing the current. Let's begin with something simple, the way you're sitting right now. Whether you realize it or not, your posture is already communicating. Research in social psychology has revealed that people who adopt expansive, open body language don't just appear more powerful to others, they actually feel more powerful themselves. Their cortisol levels drop, their testosterone rises, and their willingness to take risks increases. The body shapes the mind as much as the mind shapes the body. This is our first glimpse into how power isn't just something you have, it's something you embody. But here's where it gets interesting. While you might think power comes from being the loudest voice in the room, the opposite is often true. Studies of group dynamics show that people who speak last in discussions are frequently perceived as more authoritative than those who speak first. Why? Because silence, strategically deployed, creates the impression that your words carry more weight, that you're carefully considering rather than impulsively reacting. The person who waits isn't just listening, they're controlling the rhythm of the exchange. This brings us to a darker truth about human interaction. The scarcity principle doesn't just apply to objects, it applies to attention, to approval, to presence itself. When someone becomes less available, less predictable in their responses, something primal activates in those around them. We've all felt it, that gnawing need for validation from someone who's suddenly distant. This isn't weakness, it's evolutionary wiring. Intermittent reinforcement, the psychological term for unpredictable rewards, creates some of the strongest behavioral conditioning known to science. It's why slot machines are addictive. It's why breadcrumbing works. The intermittent withholding of what someone wants creates a dependency far more powerful than consistent availability ever could. Now, consider the questions people ask you. Most of us think questions are neutral, simple requests for information. But master manipulators know better. The way a question is framed creates the boundaries of acceptable answers. Ask someone, "Why did you make such a terrible decision?" And you've already embedded the premise that their decision was terrible. They'll likely defend themselves within that frame rather than challenging the frame itself. This is called a loaded question, and it's one of the subtlest forms of control in conversation. The person asking isn't just seeking information, they are constructing reality. Here's where motivation reveals its strange architecture. You might assume that people are driven primarily by desire for pleasure, success, connection. But psychological research tells a different story. Loss aversion, the tendency for humans to fear loss more intensely than they value gain, means that people are often more motivated by what they might lose than by what they might win. A manager who threatens job security will often see more immediate behavior change than one who promises bonuses. This asymmetry in our motivational wiring explains why negative political campaigns work, why fear-based marketing succeeds, why controlling personalities often lead with threats rather than promises. We are, at our core, more desperate to avoid pain than to pursue pleasure. And then there's the illusion of choice. Watch any skilled salesperson, any effective leader, and you'll see this technique in action. Instead of asking, "Do you want this?" they ask, "Would you prefer this in blue or red?" The question presupposes agreement to the purchase and only offers choice within constrained parameters. This is called a false dichotomy when used manipulatively, but even in benign forms, it reveals something profound. People feel more autonomous when making choices, even when those choices have been carefully curated by someone else. Control, at its most sophisticated, doesn't feel like control at all, it feels like freedom. Let's talk about reciprocity, because this might be the most socially embedded form of influence we possess. When someone does something for you, even something you didn't ask for, a psychological debt is created. This isn't about gratitude, it's deeper than that. Studies show that people will often reciprocate favors with actions of much greater value than the original gesture, simply to relieve the discomfort of feeling indebted. This is why free samples work, why small gifts from pharmaceutical companies influence doctors' prescribing habits, why cult leaders begin with minor requests before escalating to major demands. The feeling of owing someone isn't just uncomfortable, it's a form of invisible leverage that can be pulled at any time. But perhaps most unsettling is this: people don't just want to be controlled. Under certain conditions, they crave it. When overwhelmed by choices, by responsibility, by uncertainty, human beings often experience what psychologists call decision fatigue. In this state, having someone else make decisions, even important ones, brings relief rather than resentment. This is why authoritarian leaders rise during times of chaos, why people join rigid hierarchical structures, why someone might surrender their autonomy to a dominant personality. The abdication of power, paradoxically, can feel like freedom from the burden of choice. These aren't just isolated facts about human behavior. They are threads in a larger tapestry, the beginning of a map that shows how power moves through human relationships like electricity through circuits, invisible, constant, and absolutely essential to understand. And we're only just beginning to see how deep this goes. The map of power we're drawing becomes stranger the deeper we look. Because while those first patterns show us how control operates on the surface, there are layers beneath, mechanisms so deeply woven into human psychology that they function almost like invisible puppet strings. Consider the way memory itself can be weaponized. Most people believe their memories are like video recordings, accurate, fixed, reliable. But neuroscience reveals something far more malleable. Each time we recall a memory, we actually reconstruct it, and in that reconstruction, it can be altered. This is called memory reconsolidation, and it means that someone who consistently questions your recollection of events isn't just being difficult, they may be, intentionally or not, rewriting your past. That's not how it happened. You're remembering it wrong. I never said that. Repeat these statements enough, with enough confidence, and the other person begins to doubt their own perception of reality. This technique has a name, gaslighting. But it works because of a deeper truth: memory is not a fortress. It's clay, constantly being reshaped. Now let's talk about something that happens in every workplace, every family, every social group: the allocation of status through microinteractions. Research in social dynamics shows that groups naturally establish hierarchies within minutes of forming, often before anyone has said anything of substance. How? Through tiny behavioral cues: who maintains eye contact longest, who's interrupted versus who's allowed to finish speaking, whose jokes get laughed at, whose ideas get credited. These microsignals accumulate into what sociologists call interaction ritual chains. Each small exchange either reinforces or challenges the existing hierarchy. The person who learns to control these micromoments, who knows when to hold eye contact a beat longer, when to create a strategic pause, is learning to control the social architecture itself. This connects to something fascinating about human attention. We dramatically overestimate how much others are thinking about us. This cognitive bias, called the spotlight effect, means most people walk through life believing they are under far more scrutiny than they actually are. And here's where it becomes a tool of control. When someone wants to manipulate your behavior, they don't need actual surveillance. They just need you to believe you're being watched. The implication of judgment is often more powerful than judgment itself. A critical comment here, a disapproving glance there, and suddenly you're monitoring your own behavior, doing the work of control for them. The most efficient prison is the one where the inmates guard themselves. But let's examine what happens when control is challenged. You'd think that when someone's authority or dominance is questioned, they'd simply double down on their power. Sometimes they do. But psychological research reveals a more complex pattern called reactance theory. When people feel their freedom is being threatened, they're actually motivated to reassert that freedom, even in ways that harm them. Tell someone they absolutely cannot do something, and that thing suddenly becomes more attractive. This is why forbidden fruit is sweeter, why censorship backfires, why controlling personalities often face the most dramatic rebellions. The harder you grip, the more desperate people become to slip through your fingers. True control, then, isn't about tightening the leash, it's about making people forget they're wearing one at all. Here's where motivation reveals another hidden dimension: the role of meaning versus happiness. Most self-help advice suggests humans are primarily motivated by the pursuit of happiness. But research by social psychologists reveals that meaning is often a stronger motivator than happiness itself. People will endure tremendous suffering if they believe it serves a larger purpose. This is why soldiers charge into battle, why parents sacrifice sleep for crying infants, why people stay in difficult relationships if they've constructed a narrative about their importance. The person who controls the narrative, who defines what's meaningful and what's meaningless, controls motivation at its source. Give someone suffering a purpose, and they'll thank you for it. Take away that purpose, and even comfort feels hollow. Now we need to talk about projection, because it's one of the most disorienting forms of psychological manipulation. In its simplest form, projection is when someone attributes their own thoughts, feelings, or motivations to you. The person who's lying constantly accuses you of dishonesty. The person planning to leave obsesses over whether you're committed. This isn't conscious strategy, though it can be. It's often an unconscious defense mechanism. But the effect is the same. It creates confusion about who's really thinking or doing what. And in that confusion, the projector maintains control of the narrative. You're suddenly defending yourself against accusations that reveal far more about the accuser than they do about you. By the time you realize what's happening, you've already accepted the terms of a debate you should have never entered. Consider also the power of manufactured urgency. Salespeople know this instinctively. This offer expires tonight. Only 2 left in stock. But urgency is used far beyond commerce. In relationships, in negotiations, in any situation where someone wants you to make a decision without full reflection, artificial time pressure becomes a weapon. The psychological mechanism at work is called cognitive load. When your mind is processing multiple demands simultaneously, your decision-making becomes more impulsive, more emotional, less rational. By creating urgency, the controller ensures you're deciding with your reactive mind rather than your reflective one. The question isn't, do I want this, but rather, do I want to lose this? And we're back to loss aversion, that primal fear that overrides careful thought. But here's something that cuts even deeper: the paradox of choice architecture. While we've established that too many choices create decision fatigue, something else happens when choices are structured in particular ways. Research shows that when presented with 3 options, one terrible, one mediocre, one good, people overwhelmingly choose the good option. But if you present only two options, one mediocre and one good, the choice becomes much more evenly split. The terrible option wasn't there to be chosen, it was there to make the good option look better by comparison. This is called the decoy effect, and once you see it, you'll notice it everywhere. Job offers structured to make one position seem obviously superior. Menu items priced to make certain choices feel like bargains. Relationship dynamics where one person subtly presents terrible alternatives to make themselves seem like the only reasonable choice. The power isn't in the options themselves, it's in how those options are arranged. And then there's the sunk cost fallacy, that peculiar quirk of human reasoning that keeps us invested in failing endeavors simply because we've already invested so much. People stay in jobs they hate because they've been there for years. Relationships that died long ago persist because of the time already spent. Projects continue consuming resources because of money already burned. This isn't stupidity, it's a fundamental feature of human psychology. We feel loss more acutely than gain, and abandoning something we've invested in feels like crystallizing that loss, making it real. The person who understands this can trap you in almost anything by ensuring you invest just a little bit at a time. Each small investment makes walking away harder, until you're so deep that escape feels impossible. The most sophisticated traps are the ones you build yourself, one small choice at a time. Finally, consider the power of social proof, particularly in uncertain situations. When people don't know how to behave, they look to others for cues. This is why laugh tracks work on television, why long lines outside restaurants attract more customers, why testimonials sell products. But it goes darker than that. In ambiguous moral situations, people will participate in harmful behavior if they see others doing it. The famous Milgram experiments demonstrated that ordinary people will administer what they believe are dangerous electric shocks to strangers, simply because an authority figure told them to and because the situation was structured to make compliance feel normal. Social proof doesn't just guide behavior, it can override conscience itself. Create the impression that everyone's doing it, and suddenly actions that would have seemed unthinkable become almost automatic. These threads are starting to weave together now, aren't they? The way attention shapes reality, how memory can be edited, how choices can be architectured, how investment creates psychological traps. We're seeing the machinery beneath the surface, the gears and levers that turn human behavior in directions that feel chosen but are actually carefully guided. And there are deeper patterns still, waiting to be uncovered. We've been mapping the visible machinery of control, the techniques, the psychological triggers, the behavioral patterns. But now we need to descend another level, into the realm where power doesn't just influence behavior, it reshapes identity itself. Think about the language you use to describe yourself. I'm not good at math. I'm an anxious person. I'm just not a morning person. These seem like simple self-descriptions, but they are actually something far more consequential. Psychologists call this identity foreclosure, the moment when a belief about yourself hardens into a fixed identity that then constrains your future behavior. Here's the mechanism. Once you've declared I am X, acting contrary to X creates cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable tension between identity and action. So you unconsciously adjust your behavior to match your self-description. The frightening part? Other people can install these identities in you. A parent who repeatedly tells a child, "You're so shy," isn't just observing behavior, they are creating it. A partner who constantly frames you as oversensitive is building a cage made of words. The person who controls how you define yourself controls the boundaries of what you believe you can become. Now let's examine something that happens in every power dynamic, the strategic use of vulnerability. Conventional wisdom says vulnerability is weakness, that revealing your struggles gives others ammunition against you. But psychological research reveals the opposite. Strategic vulnerability is one of the most powerful tools for building trust and influence. When someone shares a carefully selected weakness or past struggle, others feel closer to them, more inclined to trust them, more likely to reciprocate with their own vulnerabilities. This is called the pratfall effect, the paradoxical finding that people who reveal minor flaws are often more likable and persuasive than those who present as perfect. But notice that word, strategic. The vulnerability must be calculated, controlled, designed to create connection without actually compromising power. Reveal that you once struggled with public speaking, and you seem relatable. Reveal that you're currently struggling with basic competence, and you lose status. The manipulation lies in engineering intimacy while maintaining control over what's actually exposed. This connects to a darker pattern in relationships: trauma bonding. Most people assume that abuse pushes people away, that cruelty breaks connections. Sometimes it does. But research into abusive relationships reveals something more disturbing. Cycles of abuse followed by affection can create some of the strongest emotional attachments humans experience. The psychological mechanism works like this. When someone causes you pain and then provides relief from that pain, your brain associates them with the relief more strongly than with the pain itself. The abuser becomes simultaneously the source of danger and the source of safety. This is intermittent reinforcement again, but weaponized at a deeper level. It's why hostages sometimes develop positive feelings toward captors, why people stay in toxic relationships, why cult members defend their abusers. The bond isn't formed despite the harm. It's formed because of the specific pattern of harm and relief. The person who understands this can create loyalty that survives almost any betrayal. Here's where we need to talk about the illusion of transparency, the cognitive bias that makes us believe our internal states are more obvious to others than they actually are. You think your nervousness is apparent to everyone in the room, but research shows they probably haven't noticed. You assume your anger is written clearly across your face, but others are often oblivious. This bias creates an opportunity for those who understand it. If you know that people vastly overestimate how much they are revealing, you can exploit their self-consciousness. The negotiator who stays silent while you squirm, convinced your desperation is obvious, is simply waiting for you to negotiate against yourself. The interviewer who pauses after your answer, leaving dead air, knows you'll likely fill that silence by undermining your own position. They're not reading your mind, they're just aware that you think they are. Now consider the concept of learned helplessness, one of the most tragic patterns in human psychology. When people are repeatedly exposed to negative outcomes they cannot control, punishment that comes regardless of their behavior, problems that persist despite their efforts, something fundamental breaks. They stop trying. Even when circumstances change and control becomes possible, they remain passive, convinced that nothing they do matters. This was first observed in laboratory experiments with animals, but it manifests everywhere in human life. Employees in dysfunctional organizations who stop suggesting improvements. People in poverty who stop seeking opportunities. Partners in controlling relationships who stop asserting boundaries. The cruelest aspect? Once learned helplessness is established, the controller barely needs to maintain active control. The victim has internalized their powerlessness so completely that they police themselves. The cage remains locked even after the key is offered. But let's look at how power perpetuates itself through something called the halo effect. When someone has high status or competence in one domain, we unconsciously assume they have competence in unrelated domains as well. The successful businessman is assumed to have wise political opinions. The physically attractive person is perceived as more intelligent and trustworthy. The confident speaker is believed to have expertise they may not possess. This cognitive shortcut, judging overall character based on one prominent trait, means that power in one area bleeds into others effortlessly. Once someone has established dominance or expertise anywhere, people grant them authority everywhere. The person who understands this doesn't fight for credibility in each domain separately, they establish it in one area and allow the halo effect to do the rest of the work. Here's something that operates in every group dynamic: the bystander effect. When multiple people witness something wrong, an injustice, an act of aggression, someone in distress, each individual is actually less likely to intervene than if they were alone. Why? Because responsibility diffuses across the group. Everyone assumes someone else will act, so no one does. This psychological phenomenon doesn't just explain emergencies ignored by crowds, it explains how abuse happens in full view of others. The controlling manager who demeans an employee in a meeting. The family member who manipulates while others watch. The toxic dynamic that everyone sees but no one addresses. The presence of witnesses doesn't prevent abuse, it often enables it, because each witness is waiting for another witness to act. The person who wields power understands this intuitively. Do it in front of everyone, and you can often do it without consequence, because everyone assumes it's someone else's responsibility to object. Now we need to examine anchoring, because it reveals how the first piece of information in any exchange disproportionately shapes everything that follows. In negotiations, whoever names a number first, even an absurd one, establishes the anchor around which all subsequent numbers orbit. Research shows that even when people know an anchor is arbitrary, it still influences their judgment. But anchoring extends far beyond numbers. The first impression, the first framing, the first narrative offered becomes the reference point against which all other information is measured. This is why controlling personalities rush to define situations before anyone else can. You're being irrational. You're overreacting. Once they've anchored the interpretation, you're arguing from a defensive position, trying to move away from their frame rather than establishing your own. The power to define reality first is often the power to define it permanently. There's also the phenomenon of variable ratio reinforcement schedules, perhaps the most powerful tool of behavioral control ever discovered. We touched on intermittent reinforcement earlier, but the specific pattern matters immensely. When rewards come unpredictably, not based on time but on a variable number of actions, the resulting behavior is extraordinarily persistent and resistant to extinction. This is the precise mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You don't know which pull of the lever will pay off, so you keep pulling. But it appears everywhere control appears. The boss who occasionally praises you unpredictably. The partner whose affection comes and goes without clear pattern. The parent whose approval seems random. These aren't just inconsistent, they're creating one of the most powerful behavioral conditioning patterns known to psychology. The person on the receiving end will work harder, tolerate more, persist longer than if rewards came consistently. The cruelty is that consistency would actually be kinder, but unpredictability is more effective. Finally, consider the power of manufactured consensus. Humans are deeply social creatures who look to group agreement as a shortcut for truth. When someone wants to control your perception, they don't need to convince you directly, they just need to create the impression that everyone else already agrees. This is why manipulators speak in plurals. People are saying, "Everyone thinks." "We all know." The research is clear. When people believe they're in the minority, they are far more likely to doubt their own judgment and conform to perceived group opinion. This is the Ask Conformity experiment playing out in real time. People will agree with obviously wrong answers if they believe everyone else sees it differently. The most insidious part is that the consensus doesn't even need to be real. The mere implication that you're alone in your perspective is often enough to make you question it. Control the sense of what everyone thinks, and you control what each person is willing to say, do, or even believe. The architecture we're revealing isn't random. These aren't isolated tricks or disconnected techniques. They're interconnected systems that reinforce each other. The way identity constrains behavior, how vulnerability engineers intimacy, how learned helplessness ensures compliance, how perceived consensus isolates dissent. We're seeing how power doesn't just push people around. It reconstructs the very terrain on which they stand. And we're still only halfway through this journey. We've traveled deep into the machinery of control, deep enough to see how power reshapes memory, identity, and even reality itself. But now we need to examine something even more fundamental: how power operates not just through what's said or done, but through what's deliberately left unsaid, undone, invisible. Let's start with something called strategic ambiguity. Most people think clarity is always virtuous, that saying exactly what you mean is the mark of honest communication. But those who understand power know that precision can be a liability. When you're vague about your intentions, your expectations, your feelings, something interesting happens. Other people fill in the blanks, usually in ways that favor you. The employee who doesn't know exactly what success looks like will work harder, casting a wider net. The romantic partner who's uncertain about where they stand will invest more effort trying to secure the relationship. The strategic use of ambiguity isn't confusion, it's control through uncertainty. Keep people slightly off balance about where they stand with you, and they'll work constantly to find solid ground. The person who never quite commits, never quite clarifies, never quite defines the terms keeps everyone else in a perpetual state of striving for clarity that never comes. Now consider something that happens in every hierarchy, the management of information asymmetry. Power doesn't just come from what you know, it comes from what others don't know that you do. In any relationship, organization, or social structure, the person who controls information flow controls the narrative. They decide what gets shared and what gets withheld, what's framed as urgent and what's downplayed as irrelevant. Research in organizational psychology shows that leaders who strategically control information access are perceived as more powerful than those who practice transparency, even when the transparent leaders are more effective. Why? Because mystery implies significance. The closed-door meeting, the private conversation, the I know something you don't dynamic creates an information hierarchy that mirrors and reinforces power hierarchies. By the time information reaches you, it's been filtered, framed, and weaponized. You're not getting reality, you're getting someone's curated version of it, designed to elicit specific responses. This connects to a particularly subtle form of control, the normalization of the extreme. If someone wants to make an unreasonable demand acceptable, they don't start there. They start with something outrageous, let you push back, then compromise to the unreasonable thing they wanted all along. This is called the door-in-the-face technique, and it works because of how our psychology processes comparison. After refusing a massive request, the smaller one feels reasonable by contrast, even if it's still excessive in absolute terms. But there's a deeper pattern here, the Overton window, the range of ideas and behaviors considered acceptable in public discourse. Shift that window by consistently introducing extreme positions, and what was once unthinkable becomes merely controversial, then debatable, then normal. The person who controls the boundaries of acceptable thought doesn't need to force compliance, they just need to gradually redefine what compliance means. By the time people notice, the unacceptable has already become ordinary. Here's where we need to talk about emotional labor and how it's weaponized. The term originally described the work of managing your own emotions for professional purposes, the flight attendant who smiles through abuse, the nurse who remains calm in chaos. But in personal relationships, emotional labor becomes something darker. One person does the work of managing both people's emotions, anticipating needs, diffusing conflicts, maintaining harmony, while the other simply exists, their emotional states accepted as facts that others must navigate around. The person who refuses to regulate their own emotions isn't weak, they are often exercising a form of power. They've made their internal whether everyone else's problem. Their anger must be managed, their sadness must be soothed, their joy must be facilitated. Meanwhile, they remain unburdened by reciprocal responsibility. The exhaustion this creates isn't incidental, it's the point. Exhausted people don't have energy for resistance, for boundaries, for demanding better. They're too busy keeping the emotional peace. Now let's examine the concept of manufactured scarcity in attention and approval. We've discussed scarcity as a principle, but the specific application to human attention reveals something crucial about modern control. In an age of constant connectivity, the most powerful move is often strategic unavailability. Don't respond immediately. Don't be consistently present. Create gaps and silences that make others wonder, worry, work harder for your attention. This isn't just playing hard to get, it's understanding that human attention has become a currency, and like all currencies, its value increases with scarcity. The psychological mechanism is straightforward. When something valuable becomes unpredictable, we prioritize it over more reliable sources. The friend who always responds immediately gets taken for granted. The one who vanishes for days and then reappears gets their calls answered at 3 in the morning. Attention scarcity creates attention hierarchy, and that hierarchy is a map of power. Consider also the technique of splitting, the practice of creating divisions between people who might otherwise unite against you. This is ancient strategy, but its psychological mechanisms are sophisticated. By telling person A something negative about person B, then telling person B something different, you create mutual suspicion that prevents alliance formation. By presenting different faces to different people, you make it difficult for them to compare notes and recognize patterns. The domestic abuser who's charming in public and cruel in private. The manager who plays favorites by criticizing each team member to the others. The friend group manipulator who has a different story for everyone. The isolation this creates isn't incidental, it's structural. When people can't trust each other's perceptions of you, they can't build collective resistance. You remain the central node through which all information flows, and that centrality is power. Here's something particularly insidious: the use of emotional flooding. When someone becomes overwhelmed with emotion, whether anger, fear, sadness, or even joy, their capacity for rational thought diminishes dramatically. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and complex decision-making, essentially goes offline while the amygdala takes control. People who understand this can deliberately trigger emotional flooding in others during crucial moments. Start a fight right before an important decision needs to be made. Create a crisis that demands an immediate response. Overpraise someone before asking for something significant. In that flooded state, people make decisions they wouldn't make in calm reflection, agree to things they'd normally refuse, accept framings they'd normally question. By the time the emotional state subsides and clarity returns, the decision is already made, the commitment already given, the line already crossed. Now we need to discuss the power of controlled disclosure, the strategic reveal. While we've talked about withholding information, the opposite action, choosing when and how to reveal something, is equally powerful. Confess to a small transgression to hide a larger one. Admit to a flaw that makes you seem self-aware while obscuring more serious deficiencies. Share a secret that creates intimacy while distracting from what you're really hiding. The research on impression management shows that people who control the timing and framing of negative information about themselves are judged far less harshly than those whose information is discovered by others. This is why politicians release bad news on Friday afternoons before holiday weekends. It's why manipulators sometimes confess to carefully selected wrongdoings. The confession itself becomes a form of control, inoculating them against larger accusations. I already told you I can be jealous sometimes, as if that admission neutralizes patterns of controlling behavior. The power isn't just in the secret, it's in being the one who decides when the secret stops being secret. There's also the phenomenon of moral licensing, which reveals something uncomfortable about human psychology. When people do something they perceive as virtuous, donate to charity, express egalitarian views, make a sacrifice for someone, they unconsciously feel licensed to then engage in less virtuous behavior. It's as if morality is a bank account that gets depleted and replenished rather than a consistent standard. Those who understand this pattern use it strategically. Make a grand gesture of generosity, and others will be less critical of subsequent selfishness. Publicly align yourself with noble causes, and people will be slower to recognize your private cruelty. The research is clear. Past good behavior makes us surprisingly blind to present bad behavior, both in ourselves and in others. The person who builds credit through visible virtue can spend that credit on invisible vice. Finally, consider the architecture of learned dependency. This is different from learned helplessness. It's not about breaking someone's will but about making yourself indispensable. You don't teach them they are powerless, you teach them that power flows only through you. The boss who never trains employees fully, ensuring they always need to ask questions. The partner who handles all the finances, leaving the other person ignorant and dependent. The parent who helps so much that their adult child never develops competence. This isn't service, it's the construction of necessity. Each time someone comes to you for something they could have learned to do themselves, the dependency deepens. The cruelty is that it often looks like generosity, feels like care, presents itself as love. Let me handle that for you, sounds nurturing until you realize it's also, don't learn to handle it yourself. The ultimate power isn't making someone need you through force, it's engineering situations where needing you feels like the natural order of things. The patterns are becoming clearer now, aren't they? We're seeing control not just as individual techniques but as complete systems: information managed, emotions manipulated, dependencies cultivated, divisions manufactured. Power at this level doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It's woven into the fabric of how people relate to each other, invisible until suddenly it's everywhere. And there are still deeper layers to uncover. We've descended through layers of control, from the visible to the subtle to the structural. But now we need to examine something that exists at the intersection of power and perception itself: how influence operates not just on what people do, but on what they believe is real. Let's begin with something called the illusion of explanatory depth. Ask most people to explain how something works: a zipper, a toilet, a bicycle, and they'll confidently begin. But push them for actual mechanical details, and the confidence crumbles. Research shows that people dramatically overestimate their understanding of how things work, how systems function, how the world operates. This gap between perceived knowledge and actual knowledge is a vulnerability that can be exploited. The person who sounds confident, who speaks in authoritative tones, who provides explanations that seem complete, can often pass off complete fabrications as fact. Most listeners won't have the depth of knowledge to challenge the explanation, and the confidence itself becomes evidence of expertise. This is how consultants bill thousands for obvious advice, how pseudoscience spreads through educated populations, how leaders maintain authority while being fundamentally wrong. The illusion isn't in what they know, it's in making others believe that challenging them would reveal the challenger's ignorance rather than the authority's incompetence. Now consider the power of context manipulation. Human behavior is far more dependent on environmental cues than most people realize. The famous Stanford prison experiment demonstrated that ordinary people could become cruel guards or submissive prisoners simply based on assigned roles and environmental setup. While that specific study had methodological flaws, the broader principle holds: change the context, and you change the behavior, often without people realizing why they are acting differently. Someone who controls the environment controls the behavior within it. The open office plan that prevents private conversations. The meeting scheduled at times when certain people can't attend. The social gathering structured to make some people comfortable and others off balance. These aren't neutral design choices, they are behavioral architecture. The person who sets the stage doesn't need to direct the play. The stage itself will do the directing. This brings us to something called the fundamental attribution error, one of the most consistent biases in human judgment. When we observe others' behavior, we attribute it to their character rather than their circumstances. Someone cuts us off in traffic, they're a terrible person. We cut someone off in traffic, the situation demanded it, we were stressed, we didn't see them. This asymmetry in how we judge ourselves versus others creates enormous opportunity for manipulation. When you control someone's circumstances but they attribute their resulting behavior to their own character flaws, you've achieved something remarkable: they are blaming themselves for your manipulation. The partner who creates impossible situations then criticizes you for not handling them gracefully. The boss who structures work to ensure failure then questions your competence. The parent who manufactures crisis then accuses you of being dramatic. You're not responding to their control, you're revealing your deficiencies. Or so the story goes. Here's where we need to talk about the concept of charisma as a tool of power. Most people think charisma is innate, a mysterious quality some people possess. But research into persuasion and influence reveals that charisma is often a learnable set of techniques: strategic eye contact, mirroring body language, speaking with vocal variety, telling compelling stories, making others feel uniquely seen. What makes these techniques powerful isn't just that they work, it's that they create an emotional response that feels authentic. When someone is truly charismatic, you don't feel manipulated. You feel understood, energized, connected. This is why charismatic leaders can lead followers into disaster while maintaining loyalty. The followers aren't stupid, they're responding to signals that evolution has wired them to interpret as signs of trustworthiness and competence. Charisma hijacks social instincts that developed to identify genuine ability and transforms them into a tool for manufacturing consent. The person who masters these techniques doesn't need to be right, they just need to feel right. Now let's examine something called extinction bursts in behavioral psychology. When a behavior that's been reinforced suddenly stops producing rewards, it doesn't immediately disappear. Instead, it intensifies dramatically before finally extinguishing. A rat that's been getting food pellets for pressing a lever will press frantically, desperately, when the pellets stop coming, pressing far more than it ever did when rewards were reliable. This same pattern appears in human behavior, and those who understand it can weaponize it. When someone who's been receiving attention, approval, or affection suddenly loses it, they don't pull back, they escalate. They try harder, reach out more, make bigger gestures. The person withdrawing knows this will happen and can use the extinction burst as evidence. See how desperate they are? See how needy? What looks like pathology is actually a predictable response to the removal of reinforcement. By understanding extinction bursts, you can engineer situations where normal responses to your withdrawal make the other person look unstable. Consider also the power of selective attention and confirmation bias working in tandem. Once someone believes something about you, that you're unreliable, brilliant, dangerous, trustworthy, they'll unconsciously seek out information that confirms that belief and ignore information that contradicts it. This isn't deliberate dishonesty, it's how human cognition works. We notice what we expect to notice. The person who can establish a first impression, plant an initial narrative, or create an early belief has essentially hacked the other person's perception. From that point forward, everything will be filtered through that lens. Your jokes will be funny if they think you're clever, offensive if they think you're mean. Your silence will be mysterious if they think you're deep, dismissive if they think you're cold. The same behavior produces completely different interpretations depending on the narrative frame. Control the frame, and you control how every subsequent action is interpreted. Here's something that operates in every long-term relationship: the sunk cost fallacy extended over time into what we might call emotional entrenchment. We discussed sunk costs earlier, but there's a compounding effect when relationships are involved. It's not just the time you've invested, it's the identity you've built around that investment. I'm the kind of person who keeps commitments. I don't give up on people. I've put too much work into this to walk away now. These identity statements become chains. The longer you stay, the harder leaving becomes, not because the situation improves but because leaving would require admitting that all the previous staying was a mistake. This creates a psychological trap where the worse things get, the more evidence you have that you should leave, but the more identity-threatening it becomes to actually do so. Those who understand this pattern don't need to make things good, they just need to keep you invested long enough that leaving would shatter your self-concept. Now we need to discuss the weaponization of empathy. Empathy, the ability to feel what others feel, is generally considered a virtue. But in the hands of someone who understands power, your empathy becomes your vulnerability. They learn your emotional triggers, discover what makes you feel guilty or responsible, identify your soft spots and then press them deliberately. I'm struggling so much, I don't know what I'd do without you. After everything I've been for you, you're going to abandon me now. Think about how this will affect me. These aren't appeals to fairness or reason, they are tactical deployments of your own empathy against your interests. The research is clear. Highly empathetic people are more susceptible to guilt manipulation and more likely to sacrifice their own well-being for others. Your empathy, which should connect you to others' genuine needs, becomes a lever that someone can pull whenever they want compliance. The cruelest part is that refusing these manipulations feels cruel, even when the appropriate response is a boundary. Your virtue has been turned into your weakness. There's also the concept of linguistic framing and how language shapes thought more than thought shapes language. The words we use don't just describe reality, they construct it. Someone isn't lying, they're struggling with their truth. They're not controlling, they're passionate. Not manipulative, but strategic. Not abuse, but conflict. The person who controls the vocabulary controls what can be easily discussed and what becomes difficult to articulate. Research in linguistics shows that having a word for something makes that thing easier to recognize and discuss. Remove the word, or replace it with euphemism, and the concept itself becomes slippery, harder to grasp, easier to dismiss. This is why abusive relationships often develop private languages, specialized vocabularies that reframe harm as care, control as concern. By the time you try to explain it to others, you find yourself using words that don't quite capture what's happening, because the words that would capture it have been systematically replaced. Finally, let's examine the role of isolation in maintaining control. Not just physical isolation, though that's part of it, but informational and social isolation. When someone can control who you talk to, what information you access, which perspectives you encounter, they're not just limiting your resources, they are shaping your reality. This is why cults isolate members, why abusive partners cut off external friendships, why authoritarian regimes control media. But it happens in subtler ways too. The boss who discourages water cooler conversations. The friend who makes you feel guilty for spending time with others. The family member who interprets any outside relationship as betrayal. The mechanism is the same. By controlling your information environment, they control what seems normal, what seems possible, what seems true. You're not being sheltered or protected, you're being kept in an informational monoculture where only their version of reality can grow. And without access to alternative perspectives, their version becomes the only version, not through persuasion but through monopoly. The architecture we're revealing has reached a new level of sophistication. We're no longer just talking about influence techniques, we're examining how reality itself becomes malleable when someone understands these principles. How behavior, perception, identity, and truth can all be shaped by those who control context, language, and access to alternative frameworks. But there are still patterns we haven't yet illuminated. We've mapped the territory of control from its surface manifestations down to its reality-bending depths. But now we need to examine the final layer, the one that reveals how power doesn't just change what people do or think, but fundamentally transforms who they become. Let's start with something called behavioral residue. Even after escaping a controlling situation, people carry forward the behaviors they learned under control. The employee who left the micromanaging boss still over-explains simple decisions. The adult who grew up in a chaotic home still anticipates catastrophe in stable situations. The person who escaped an abusive relationship still apologizes for existing. This isn't weakness or inability to move on, it's how deeply behavioral conditioning imprints itself. Those neural pathways don't simply vanish when circumstances change. What's particularly insidious is that this residue can attract new controllers, because the behaviors signal susceptibility. Someone who's been trained to doubt their own perception will attract those who need someone to accept their reality. Someone who's learned to prioritize others' emotions will attract those who need their emotions managed. The control outlives the controller, encoded in the nervous system itself. Now consider the role of incremental boundary erosion. Major boundary violations are often easy to recognize and resist. But power rarely operates through obvious transgressions. Instead, it tests boundaries with small violations, watching for resistance. Can I show up 15 minutes late without apology? Can I criticize you in front of others? Can I go through your phone? Each small violation that goes unchallenged establishes a new baseline. Before long, behaviors that would have been unthinkable at the relationship's beginning have become normal. This is the boiling frog principle applied to human boundaries. The research on relationship dynamics shows that the biggest predictor of major boundary violations isn't pathology, it's the success of minor violations. The person who respects a firm early boundary often never escalates. The person who successfully crosses a small boundary learns that boundaries are negotiable, mere suggestions rather than actual limits. By the time you recognize the pattern, the erosion has fundamentally altered the landscape of what's acceptable. This connects to something researchers call the consistency principle, the psychological pressure to behave consistently with our past behavior. Once you've agreed to something small, you experience internal pressure to agree to related, larger requests because refusing would make you seem inconsistent. This is more than just the foot-in-the-door technique we might associate with sales. It's about identity construction. I'm the kind of person who helps friends, becomes a trap when a friend's requests become unreasonable. I'm not rigid or controlling becomes a vulnerability when setting boundaries gets framed as controlling behavior. The person who understands this doesn't ask for everything at once. They get you to establish a pattern, then leverage your need to see yourself as consistent. Your own desire for internal coherence becomes the chain that binds you. Here's where we need to examine the dark side of reciprocity norms, specifically reciprocal disclosure. When someone shares something personal with you, social pressure demands you reciprocate with something equally personal. This seems like the foundation of intimacy, and in healthy relationships it is. But it can also be weaponized. The person who shares a calculated vulnerability, one that makes them seem open while revealing nothing truly compromising, creates pressure for you to share something genuinely vulnerable. They've now gained information asymmetry while appearing to have created parity. Intelligence agencies use this technique in recruitment. Manipulators use it in relationships. They engineer intimacy while maintaining control, because the intimacy only flows one direction. You've been genuinely vulnerable while they've been strategically vulnerable. The appearance of mutual disclosure masks the reality of one-sided exposure. Now let's talk about the power of normalized volatility. When someone's behavior becomes unpredictably volatile, explosive anger followed by warmth, criticism followed by praise, withdrawal followed by intense attention, something counterintuitive happens. Instead of leaving, many people become hypervigilant, constantly monitoring for signals about which version of the person they're getting. This monitoring becomes all-consuming. Your attention is perpetually focused on them, reading their mood, adjusting your behavior to manage their state. The psychological mechanism is classical conditioning. You're in a constant state of anticipation, never knowing if you'll get the reward or the punishment. This isn't just stressful, it's attention monopolizing. Someone whose moods are stable and predictable doesn't occupy much of your mental bandwidth. Someone whose reactions are volatile occupies all of it. The volatility isn't a flaw in their control, it is the control. Your entire cognitive resources become devoted to managing a relationship with someone who's deliberately unmanageable. Consider also the phenomenon of gaslighting at scale, not just individual reality distortion but collective reality distortion. When someone doesn't just contradict your memory but recruits others to support their version of events, something far more destabilizing occurs. I asked your mother, she agrees you're being irrational. I talked to your coworkers, they see the same problems with your performance. Whether these conversations actually happened or whether the others actually agree becomes almost irrelevant. The mere claim of consensus is often enough to make you doubt your own perception. This is the Ask Conformity experiments weaponized in personal relationships. Research shows that people will doubt even clear sensory evidence when they believe everyone else perceives it differently. When someone can create the impression that your reality is the outlier, that everyone else sees things their way, your grip on your own perception loosens. You're not just questioning what happened, you're questioning your ability to know what happened. Here's something that operates beneath conscious awareness: mirroring and matching as a tool of false rapport. Skilled manipulators subtly mimic your body language, speech patterns, even your breathing rhythm. Research in social psychology shows that this mirroring creates feelings of connection and trust, even when the person being mirrored doesn't consciously notice it. It's an evolutionary shortcut. People who move like us, speak like us, breathe like us are usually part of our tribe, and therefore trustworthy. But when this natural social bonding mechanism is deployed strategically, it manufactures intimacy that isn't real. You feel understood, connected, like you found someone who truly gets you. What you're actually responding to is your own patterns being reflected back to you. The person isn't empathizing, they're performing empathy, using your own behavioral signature to create the illusion of deep connection. By the time you realize the connection was manufactured, you've already made decisions based on that false sense of intimacy. Now we need to discuss the exploitation of hope as a control mechanism. Hope, which should be empowering, becomes paralyzing when someone learns to dangle just enough possibility to keep you engaged. Things will get better. I'm working on myself. Just give me one more chance. The statement is never an outright lie. It contains just enough truth or possibility that dismissing it feels like giving up prematurely. Research on intermittent reinforcement shows that hope is most powerful and most persistent when occasionally validated. The relationship that's terrible 90% of the time but wonderful 10% of the time generates more powerful hope than one that's mediocre all the time. That 10% becomes evidence that the wonderful version is the real version, that you just need to be patient, supportive, understanding enough to bring it out consistently. But the inconsistency isn't a bug, it's the feature that keeps you hoping, trying, staying. The moment you stop hoping is the moment you might leave. As long as you're hoping, you're staying. And so hope, that most human of emotions, becomes the mechanism of your captivity. There's also the strategic use of confession and apology without change. When someone apologizes eloquently after causing harm, something peculiar happens in the victim's psychology. The apology itself provides a form of relief, acknowledgement of the harm, validation that it was real, promise that it won't happen again. This relief can feel like resolution even before any actual change occurs. But if the apology isn't followed by behavioral change, it becomes a tool for maintaining the status quo. The research is clear. People are remarkably willing to accept repeated apologies for repeated harm, especially when those apologies are emotionally compelling. Each apology resets the clock, buys more time, provides a release valve for mounting frustration. The person who's mastered the performance of remorse without the substance of change has essentially found a renewable resource. Each apology purchases another cycle of the same behavior. You're not in a pattern of harm, apology, and change. You're in a pattern of harm, apology, and harm again. The apology isn't the beginning of change, it's the thing that prevents change from being necessary. Finally, let's examine the concept of force teaming. This is the use of premature we language to create a false sense of alliance. We need to figure this out. We're in this together. We both know what's really happening here. The word we presupposes agreement, shared interest, aligned goals. But often, the person using we is actually acting against your interests while linguistically positioning themselves as your partner. This is particularly effective because contradicting it feels like betraying an alliance that hasn't actually been formed. We need to keep this between us isn't a request, it's a presumption of complicity. We both want what's best for the family frames any disagreement as being against the family. The research on linguistic manipulation shows that these subtle pronoun choices significantly impact how people perceive situations and their role in them. By the time you notice you've been linguistically drafted into a team you never agreed to join, you've often already acted as though you were a member. The alliance was never real, but your behavior based on the presumed alliance is. We've now traced power through every layer, from simple influence techniques to reality distortion to identity transformation to linguistic control. What emerges isn't a simple picture of strong people dominating weak people. It's a complex architecture where understanding these mechanisms provides leverage regardless of traditional power markers like size, wealth, or formal authority. The real power is in understanding the machinery itself. And now, as we approach the final stretch, we need to examine what all of this means, how to recognize these patterns, what protection looks like, and perhaps most importantly, what responsibility comes with understanding how control operates. We've journeyed through the complete machinery of control, from surface techniques to deep psychological architecture. But now we need to examine something crucial, the meta-level patterns that explain not just how power works, but why it persists even when recognized. Let's begin with something called change-back attacks. When someone in a dysfunctional system starts to change, setting boundaries, refusing manipulation, becoming healthier, the system often attacks that change ferociously. This isn't because others consciously want to harm you. It's because your change destabilizes the entire structure. If you stop overfunctioning, someone else has to start functioning. If you stop accepting blame, someone else becomes accountable. If you stop managing everyone's emotions, people have to manage their own. The research on family systems and organizational behavior shows that the person attempting healthy change often faces the strongest resistance from those who would benefit most from that change. They've built their entire equilibrium around your dysfunction. Your health threatens their homeostasis. This is why change is hardest not when you first recognize the problem, but when you try to act on that recognition. The system will pull harder to restore the old pattern than it ever pulled to maintain your well-being. Now consider the concept of malicious compliance and how it reveals the limits of control. When someone has power over your behavior but not your motivation, you can comply with the letter of their demands while violating the spirit. The employee who does exactly what's asked and nothing more. The teenager who follows every rule while radiating contempt. This isn't passive resistance, it's active demonstration that behavior without buy-in is hollow. What's fascinating is that this technique exposes a fundamental truth about power. You can control actions, but controlling meaning is far more difficult. The same behavior can be an act of submission or an act of rebellion depending on the intention behind it. True power would control not just what people do but why they do it, what it means to them, how they experience their own actions. Anything less is just the appearance of control over the reality of resistance. This connects to something called psychological reactance at the identity level. We discussed reactance earlier, the motivation to reassert freedom when it's threatened. But there's a deeper version that operates on identity itself. When someone tries to define who you are, to assign you a fixed identity, something in the human psyche rebels. You're too sensitive. You're not the kind of person who. That's just how you are. These statements don't just describe, they constrain. They're attempts to solidify your identity in ways that serve the speaker's narrative. The resistance to this isn't stubbornness, it's a fundamental human need for self-determination. Research in self-determination theory shows that autonomy, the sense that you're authoring your own life, is a basic psychological need, as fundamental as food or safety. When someone tries to author your identity for you, you're not just resisting their specific claim. You're resisting the existential threat of having your self-definition controlled by another person. Here's where we need to talk about the paradox of self-awareness in manipulation. You might think that understanding these control mechanisms would make you immune to them. It doesn't. Knowing that scarcity increases perceived value doesn't make you immune to scarcity marketing. Understanding intermittent reinforcement doesn't stop it from affecting you. Recognizing a sunk cost fallacy doesn't make walking away easy. This is because these mechanisms operate at a level deeper than conscious reasoning. They're evolutionary, neurological, automatic. What self-awareness provides isn't immunity, it's the ability to notice what's happening, to create space between stimulus and response, to choose whether to override your automatic reactions. But that choice requires constant effort. The manipulator can rely on your automatic responses. You have to consciously resist them. It's an asymmetric battle where awareness helps but doesn't guarantee victory. Now let's examine something called strategic incompetence. This is the deliberate performance of incompetence to avoid responsibility. Do the task badly enough, and no one will ask you to do it again. Forget important things frequently enough, and others will stop trusting you with them. Mess up emotionally challenging conversations, and people will stop bringing you their problems. This isn't about actual inability, it's about discovered incentives. Research shows that in relationships and organizations, people quickly learn what behaviors lead to more responsibility and what behaviors lead to less. Strategic incompetence is the weaponization of that learning. The person isn't incapable, they are performing incapability because they've recognized that competence is punished with additional demands. The tragedy is that this leaves competent people overloaded, doing not just their own work but compensating for those who've learned that failure is easier than success. Consider also the phenomenon of defensive attribution, which explains why victims often get blamed. When something bad happens to someone, observers have a choice: believe it could happen to anyone, including themselves, or believe the victim did something to cause it. The second option is psychologically more comfortable because it preserves the illusion of control, If the victim caused it, then by not doing what they did, you can stay safe. This is why rape victims get asked what they were wearing, why fraud victims get told they should have been more careful, why people in abusive relationships hear, "Why didn't you just leave?" The blame isn't based on logic, it's based on the observer's need to feel safe by believing the world is just and controllable. This cognitive bias doesn't just hurt victims, it empowers perpetrators. As long as observers can find ways to blame the victim, the perpetrator's control tactics remain invisible, unremarked upon, normalized. Here's something that operates in every power structure: the principle of plausible deniability. True masters of control rarely issue direct commands or make explicit threats. Instead, they create situations where the desired outcome is merely suggested, implied, hinted at. The boss who says, "I'd hate to see you damage your career over this," hasn't explicitly threatened you, but the threat is clear. The partner who says, "I guess I'm just too much for you to handle," hasn't asked you to change, but the pressure to prove them wrong is unmistakable. This ambiguity serves multiple purposes. First, it makes confrontation difficult. You're responding to implications, which they can always deny. Second, it makes you do the work of interpretation, often in directions that serve their interests. Third, it provides them cover if accused, "I never said that, you're putting words in my mouth." The research on indirect speech and social coordination shows that humans are remarkably good at understanding implied messages. Manipulators exploit this capacity by operating in the space between explicit statement and understood meaning. Now we need to discuss the role of self-fulfilling prophecies in power dynamics. When someone treats you as though you're untrustworthy, incompetent, or unstable, your behavior often shifts to confirm their expectation, not because the assessment was accurate, but because their treatment of you creates the conditions for the behavior they predicted. Tell someone repeatedly they're irresponsible, and they stop trying to be responsible. Why bother when you'll be accused anyway? Treat someone like they're a liar, and they start concealing truth because honesty gets them punished the same as dishonesty. The psychological term is the Pygmalion effect when positive, the Golem effect when negative. But both reveal the same truth: expectations shape reality. Those who understand this can create the very problems they claim to be responding to, then point to those problems as evidence of the other person's fundamental flaws. You're not revealing who someone is, you're constructing who they become. There's also the strategic deployment of crisis and chaos. When someone keeps you in perpetual crisis mode, financial emergencies, relationship drama, health scares, constant urgent problems, your cognitive resources are depleted. You're operating in survival mode, which means shortened time horizons, impaired judgment, and reduced capacity for strategic thinking. Research on stress and decision-making shows that chronic stress literally changes brain function, shifting activity away from the prefrontal cortex toward more primitive reactive centers. In this state, you're not planning an exit, you're just trying to get through the day. The person who creates or maintains perpetual crisis doesn't need to directly control your decisions. Crisis does it for them. You're too exhausted to leave, too overwhelmed to plan, too depleted to imagine alternatives. The chaos isn't a sign of lost control, it is the control. Finally, let's examine the concept of loyalty testing. This is when someone creates unnecessary situations to test whether you'll choose them over your own interests, your own perceptions, your own well-being. If you really loved me, you'd prove you're committed by. Choose between me and. These aren't requests for reassurance, they're exercises of power disguised as relationship maintenance. The research on coercive control shows that loyalty tests tend to escalate. Pass one test, and a harder one comes. Because the goal isn't actually to verify loyalty, it's to demonstrate that your loyalty supersedes your judgment. Each test you pass establishes a new precedent. Your boundaries, your relationships, your reality are all negotiable if they conflict with proving your commitment. By the time you recognize the pattern, you've already sacrificed so much to prove your loyalty that acknowledging the manipulation would mean admitting all those sacrifices were for nothing. The test isn't designed to be passed, it's designed to be perpetual. What we're seeing now is the full circle of control, how it establishes itself, maintains itself, defends itself against change, and perpetuates itself even when recognized. These aren't isolated techniques anymore. They're an entire ecosystem of power, each element reinforcing the others, creating structures that survive awareness, resist change, and regenerate even after apparent dismantling. But understanding the architecture also reveals something else: the points of vulnerability in these systems, the places where awareness can become leverage, where recognition can become liberation. We've mapped the complete ecosystem of control, how it builds, sustains, and defends itself. But now we need to examine the most sophisticated level: how power operates through systems that appear to be the opposite of control, and how understanding these mechanisms changes the observer. Let's start with something called performative vulnerability as dominance. We discussed strategic vulnerability earlier, but there's a more complex version where someone uses their pain, their trauma, their struggles as a shield against accountability. You can't criticize me, I'm dealing with so much. After everything I've been through, how dare you make demands? The vulnerability is real, the trauma may be genuine, but it's being deployed as a tool to center their experience in every situation and to make their feelings the priority in every interaction. Research on emotional labor and relational dynamics shows that weaponized vulnerability creates a peculiar power structure. The person who is suffering the most gets to determine what everyone else can say, do, or need. Compassion, which should create connection, becomes a mechanism of control. Your needs become selfish. Your boundaries become cruelty. Your reality becomes less important than their pain. And because challenging this feels like attacking someone who's already wounded, they're insulated from accountability. Suffering becomes armor, and that armor is impenetrable. Now consider the architecture of competitive victimhood. In some dynamics, people compete over who has suffered more, who has been wronged more severely, who deserves more sympathy. This isn't about genuine pain, it's about the social and relational capital that victim status provides in certain contexts. The research is uncomfortable but clear. In environments where victimhood grants moral authority, people will sometimes exaggerate harm or frame every disagreement as an attack because victim status provides leverage. "You hurt me" becomes not just a statement of feeling but a trump card in any conflict. The person who can claim greater injury wins the argument by default. What makes this pattern so corrosive is that it makes distinguishing genuine harm from strategic claims nearly impossible, which ultimately delegitimizes actual victims. But for those operating within this framework, that confusion is useful. Moral clarity would threaten their tactical advantage. This connects to something called DAVO: deny, attack, reverse victim and offender. When confronted with wrongdoing, instead of accountability, the accused denies the action, attacks the accuser's credibility or motives, and positions themselves as the real victim. "I never did that, you're making things up, and actually you're the abusive one for even suggesting it." Research on institutional abuse and interpersonal manipulation shows this pattern is remarkably effective because it overwhelms the accuser with the need to defend themselves rather than maintaining focus on the original harm. Suddenly you're not discussing what they did, you're defending your perception, your memory, your right to even raise the issue. The reversal is so disorienting that many people simply give up, not because the tactic convinced them they were wrong, but because continuing requires fighting battles on multiple fronts simultaneously. The exhaustion is the point. If raising issues is more draining than tolerating harm, people stop raising issues. Here's where we need to examine the concept of distributed responsibility in systems of control. In hierarchical or group situations, harm often occurs not through any single person's clear wrongdoing but through a diffusion of responsibility where everyone plays a small role and no one feels accountable. The committee that made a harmful decision, but no individual feels responsible because they just went along with the group. The family system where everyone enables dysfunction but each person can point to others as the real problem. Research in organizational behavior and social psychology shows that the more people involved in a harmful action, the less individual guilt each person feels. This isn't just the bystander effect, it's structural diffusion of accountability. The system becomes abusive while each individual within it maintains their self-concept as basically good. When control is distributed across enough people, it becomes nearly impossible to locate, challenge, or dismantle, because there's no single controller to confront. The control is in the structure itself, and structures can't feel guilt. Now let's talk about something called the just world hypothesis and how it perpetuates power imbalances. Humans have a deep psychological need to believe the world is fundamentally just, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. This belief is comforting because it suggests the universe has moral order, that you can protect yourself through good behavior. But this cognitive bias has a dark consequence. When we see someone suffering, we unconsciously assume they must have done something to deserve it. The person in poverty must be lazy. The abuse victim must have provoked it. The person passed over for promotion must be incompetent. This isn't malice, it's motivated reasoning designed to preserve the belief in a just world. But the effect is that existing power structures get reinforced. Those with power are assumed to deserve it. Those without power are assumed to deserve their lack. The bias doesn't just explain power, it justifies it, makes it seem like the natural moral order rather than a constructed hierarchy. Consider also the phenomenon of ethical fading, where good people participate in harmful systems by gradually losing sight of the ethical dimensions of their actions. The process is incremental, each small compromise seems minor, each step away from your values is framed as necessary or pragmatic. Research shows that people can end up in positions completely at odds with their stated values without experiencing themselves as having changed. The frame shifts from "is this right?" to "is this normal?" to "is this what everyone else is doing?" By the time you're deep in a corrupt system, you've forgotten you ever had the option to refuse entry. This is why good intentions don't protect against participating in control systems. The road to complicity is paved with small compromises, each one seeming reasonable at the time, until you've become something you never intended to be. The person wielding power doesn't need you to be evil, they just need you to be gradually accommodating. Here's something that operates in broader social structures: the concept of manufactured consent. In democratic or ostensibly egalitarian systems, overt force is often unnecessary because consent can be engineered through control of information, framing of options, and manipulation of perceived choices. You're not forced to agree, you're presented with situations structured so that agreement seems like the only reasonable option. Research in political psychology and media studies shows that people's opinions can be shaped not through obvious propaganda but through agenda setting, selective emphasis, and framing effects. The person who controls what questions get asked, what options are considered legitimate, what information is accessible doesn't need to control your answer. They've already controlled the boundaries within which your answer can exist. You feel free because you're choosing, but the menu was written by someone else. Now we need to discuss the power of institutional capture. This is when systems ostensibly designed to protect against abuse become tools of abuse themselves. The HR department that protects the company rather than employees. The family therapy that gets weaponized by the abusive partner. The legal system that becomes a tool of harassment through frivolous lawsuits. The very mechanisms meant to provide accountability or protection get turned into extensions of control. This is particularly devastating because it eliminates refuge. Where do you appeal when the appeals process has been captured? Research on institutional betrayal shows that harm inflicted by institutions people trusted for protection causes deeper trauma than harm from expected sources. The betrayal isn't just individual, it's systemic. And once you understand that protective institutions can become instruments of harm, trust itself becomes complicated. The controller doesn't need to prevent you from seeking help, they just need to have gotten there first. There's also something called preference falsification on a social scale. When people publicly express preferences they don't privately hold because they believe everyone else genuinely holds those preferences, you get entire societies built on lies that everyone is collectively maintaining. No one actually believes the emperor has clothes, but everyone acts as if they do because they think they are alone in their doubt. This creates an information cascade where false consensus becomes self-reinforcing. Research in political science shows that preference falsification can keep unjust systems stable for decades, until some triggering event reveals that the supposed consensus was always an illusion. But the revelation requires someone to break the silence, to risk speaking truth while believing they are alone. The power of controlling public narrative isn't that everyone genuinely believes it, it's that everyone believes everyone else believes it, and that belief is enough to maintain the system. Finally, let's examine the concept of the observer effect in power dynamics, how the act of understanding these mechanisms inevitably changes you. This isn't physics, it's psychology. Once you can see the machinery of control, you can't unsee it. You start recognizing patterns everywhere, in relationships, in institutions, in yourself. The research on trauma-informed awareness and therapeutic growth shows this recognition often comes with a cost: the loss of innocence, the end of certain relationships, the burden of seeing what others don't. You become, in a sense, outside the matrix, watching patterns that others are still embedded within. This can be isolating. It can make you cynical. It can also make you more conscious, more intentional, more free. The question becomes, what do you do with this knowledge? Do you use it to protect yourself? To protect others? Or do you risk becoming what you've learned to recognize, someone who uses understanding of these patterns not to resist control but to exercise it more effectively? We've reached a crucial threshold. We understand not just how power operates but why it persists, how it hides, how it reproduces itself across scales from individual relationships to entire societies. We've seen how good people participate in harmful systems, how protective structures become tools of harm, how awareness itself is complicated. But there's one final layer we need to examine, perhaps the most important one. What does it mean to move through a world where these patterns are everywhere, where power is this pervasive and this sophisticated? What does resistance look like? What does freedom look like? And perhaps most crucially, how do we hold this knowledge without becoming what we've studied? We've traced power from individual techniques through systemic structures to the point where we understand how it captures institutions and manufactures consent. But now we need to examine the final mechanisms, the ones that operate at the intersection of individual psychology and collective behavior, where personal power dynamics scale into cultural patterns. Let's start with something called the spiral of silence. When people believe their opinions are in the minority, they become less willing to express them publicly. This creates a feedback loop where the loudest voices appear to represent majority opinion, which further silences those who disagree, which makes the loud voices seem even more representative. Research in communication theory shows this spiral doesn't require actual majority, it only requires the perception of majority. The person who can create the impression that everyone thinks this way effectively silences dissent without ever directly suppressing it. In relationships, this manifests as one person's reality becoming the reality simply because they state it more confidently and consistently. In organizations, it's how toxic cultures persist, not because everyone agrees, but because everyone thinks they are alone in disagreeing. The silence isn't evidence of consent. It's evidence of isolation. But from the outside, silence and agreement look identical. Now consider the phenomenon of schismogenesis, the tendency for relationships to develop complementary patterns that become increasingly extreme over time. One person becomes more demanding, which makes the other more accommodating, which enables more demanding behavior, which requires more accommodation. Or one person withdraws emotionally, which causes the other to pursue more intensely, which causes more withdrawal, which intensifies the pursuit. The anthropologist Gregory Bateson identified this pattern in cultural interactions, but it operates powerfully in personal relationships. What makes it insidious is that both parties feel they're responding to the other person's behavior, and both are correct. Neither feels like they are choosing the pattern, they are reacting to it. But the pattern itself is the problem, and it escalates regardless of either person's intentions. The person who understands schismogenesis can trigger these spirals deliberately, knowing that once started, they become self-perpetuating. You're not being controlled by their actions, you're being controlled by the pattern their actions initiated. This connects to something called emotional contagion at scale. Emotions spread through social networks like viruses, not as metaphor, but as measurable phenomenon. Research shows that if your friend becomes happier, your likelihood of happiness increases. But it works for negative emotions too, and faster. Anxiety, anger, fear, these spread through groups more rapidly than positive emotions. Someone who can reliably trigger strong emotions in one person can effectively spread those emotions through an entire network. The angry person at the family dinner doesn't just affect the people they're angry at, they affect everyone present, who then carry that emotional residue into their next interactions. In digital spaces, this effect amplifies exponentially. One person's outrage can cascade through thousands. The control isn't over individuals, it's over the emotional climate of entire systems. And emotional climates shape what feels possible, what feels safe, what feels normal. Here's where we need to talk about the construction of information ecosystems. We live in an era where your information environment can be completely different from someone else's, yet both of you believe you're seeing objective reality. Algorithmic curation, selective social circles, curated news sources, these create epistemic bubbles where certain information never penetrates. But this principle operates in personal relationships too. The partner who controls what news you see, which friends you maintain, what perspectives you encounter isn't just limiting your access, they're constructing your reality. Research in media studies and psychology shows that people's sense of what's true is powerfully shaped by what information they're repeatedly exposed to and what information they never encounter. You don't know what you don't know. And the person controlling your information flow ensures there are things you don't know you don't know. By the time you discover the gaps in your information, you've already made decisions based on an incomplete picture of reality. Now let's examine something called the drama triangle, a pattern identified in transactional analysis. In dysfunctional dynamics, people rotate through three roles: victim, persecutor, and rescuer. The victim feels helpless and seeks rescue. The persecutor blames and attacks. The rescuer enables by solving problems the victim should solve themselves. But here's the key: everyone plays all three roles at different times, and the roles perpetuate each other. The rescuer creates victims by preventing them from developing competence. The victim provokes persecutors by refusing responsibility. The persecutor creates victims through their attacks. What makes this pattern so stable is that each role feels justified. The rescuer feels noble. The victim feels wronged. The persecutor feels righteous. And the triangle spins, with everyone taking turns in each position, and no one recognizing they're participating in a system that harms everyone involved. The person who understands this pattern can manipulate which role you occupy, knowing that whichever role you're in, you'll be helping maintain the system. Consider also the power of manufactured nostalgia and idealized pasts. Remember when things were good between us? It wasn't always like this. We used to be so happy. These appeals to a golden past serve several functions. First, they create hope that you can return to that state, which keeps you invested in trying. Second, they reframe the current dysfunction as a departure from the norm rather than recognizing the pattern as the norm. Third, they position the person speaking as someone who wants to return to that good place, making them seem aligned with your desire for things to improve. Research in memory and relationships shows that people systematically misremember the past, emphasizing positive memories and minimizing negative ones, a bias called rosy retrospection. The manufactured nostalgia exploits this bias. That golden period they are referencing might have been brief, atypical, or even imaginary. But the emotional power of the appeal isn't in its accuracy, it's in making you believe that what you're hoping for is actually a return to something you once had, rather than a fantasy of something that never existed. Here's something that operates across all scales of power: the concept of thin slicing and snap judgments. Research by psychologists like Nalini Ambady shows that people make remarkably accurate judgments about others based on incredibly brief exposures, sometimes just seconds. We assess trustworthiness, competence, status based on microsignals we process unconsciously. This means power establishes itself almost instantly, often before anyone has said anything substantive. The person who understands what signals communicate power, the right posture, the right tone, the right pacing, can establish dominance in the first few seconds of an interaction. By the time conscious evaluation happens, the unconscious judgment has already formed. This is why first impressions are so powerful and so difficult to overcome. The initial framing colors everything that follows. The person who controls those first seconds of interaction has already shaped how everything they subsequently say or do will be interpreted. Now we need to discuss the role of moral licensing in perpetuating harm. We touched on this earlier, but there's a collective version that operates in groups and institutions. When an organization makes one progressive hire, they often feel licensed to ignore systemic discrimination. When a person does one generous act, they feel entitled to subsequent selfishness. Research shows this isn't hypocrisy, it's how moral accounting actually works in human psychology. We balance the books. One good deed pays for several bad ones in our internal ledger. The person or institution that understands this can do strategic good, highly visible, well-publicized moral actions that purchase permission for far more significant but less visible harm. The good act isn't undermined by the bad acts, it provides cover for them. And because observers also engage in moral accounting, that one good act disproportionately shapes how the person or institution is perceived. The small visible good outweighs the large invisible harm in public assessment. There's also the phenomenon of pluralistic ignorance, where most members of a group privately reject a norm but incorrectly assume most others accept it, so they go along publicly. Everyone's faking agreement with something no one actually agrees with. This creates situations where harmful dynamics persist not because anyone wants them but because everyone thinks everyone else wants them. The abusive workplace culture that survives because everyone assumes everyone else is fine with it. The family tradition that nobody enjoys but everyone maintains because they think others expect it. Research shows that revealing even one person's private disagreement can collapse these false consensus structures immediately. But until that happens, the norm appears solid, legitimate, desired by the collective. The person who benefits from these norms doesn't need to convince everyone they're good, they just need to prevent people from discovering that others also think they're bad. Finally, let's examine the concept of systems justification, the psychological tendency to defend and rationalize existing social arrangements, even when those arrangements disadvantage you. Research by John Jost and others shows that people often support systems that harm them because accepting the system's legitimacy is psychologically easier than accepting that you live in an unjust world where you're being harmed. This is why the oppressed sometimes defend their oppressors, why people accept inequality as natural, why victims internalize blame. It's not false consciousness or stupidity, it's motivated reasoning designed to preserve psychological stability. Accepting that the system is fundamentally unjust is destabilizing, threatening, overwhelming. Accepting that the system is fair and you just happen to be on the losing end of fair competition is, paradoxically, more comfortable. The person or institution that benefits from unjust systems doesn't need to suppress awareness of injustice, they just need to provide plausible justifications for why the system is actually fair. Most people will embrace those justifications, not because they are convincing but because the alternative is too psychologically costly. We've now seen how personal power dynamics scale upward into group dynamics, organizational patterns, and even societal structures. The same mechanisms that work in a relationship work in a workplace, work in a culture. Silent spirals, emotional contagion, information control, role triangles, false consensus, system justification, these aren't different phenomena at different scales. They're the same architecture of power, fractal patterns that repeat from the intimate to the institutional. And now, finally, we're ready to pull all of these threads together, to see the complete picture of how power operates, persists, and ultimately what it means to navigate a world built on these foundations. We began this journey with a simple observation: there's a moment in every interaction when power shifts, invisible as air but unmistakable in its effects. Now, 90 minutes later, we understand that moment completely. We've traced power from its surface mechanics through psychological architecture to systemic structures to collective patterns. Now we need to see how all of these threads weave together into a single tapestry, and what that complete picture means. The story we've uncovered isn't about good people versus bad people. It's about mechanisms so deeply embedded in human psychology that they operate regardless of intention. The person who uses intermittent reinforcement to create addiction-like attachment patterns might not even realize what they are doing. They just know that being unpredictable keeps people interested. The one who employs strategic ambiguity might genuinely believe they are being thoughtful rather than manipulative. The one who gaslights might be so disconnected from objective reality themselves that they truly believe their version of events. Intent doesn't determine impact. The machinery runs whether anyone's operating it consciously or not. What we've discovered is that power operates through paradox. Control is most effective when it feels like freedom, the architectured choice that seems autonomous, the dependency that presents as care, the isolation that frames itself as protection. The most sophisticated power doesn't announce itself. It creates conditions where compliance feels like personal choice, where resistance feels like irrationality, where escape feels like betrayal. You're not being controlled, you're just making the only sensible decision given the reality you're perceiving. Except that reality has been carefully constructed. Here's the first crucial synthesis. All of these mechanisms share a common feature. They exploit the gap between automatic and reflective thinking. Our brains evolved to make rapid assessments based on limited information. We judge trustworthiness in milliseconds through thin slicing. We rely on heuristics like scarcity and social proof because evaluating everything consciously would be paralyzing. We mirror others' emotions through contagion because social coordination required emotional synchronization. These automatic processes served our survival for millennia. But they can be hijacked. Every technique we've explored works by triggering automatic responses that bypass conscious evaluation. The person who understands this isn't smarter or stronger, they're just operating at a different level of awareness, using your fast thinking against your slow thinking. The second synthesis reveals something about identity and reality construction. We've seen how power shapes not just behavior but belief, how memories can be edited through persistent contradiction, how identities can be installed through repeated assertion, how reality itself becomes negotiable when someone controls your information environment. What emerges is a disturbing truth. There's no fixed self standing apart from these influences, objectively observing reality. The self is constructed through interaction, shaped by the narratives we're told and tell ourselves, maintained through the stories we believe about who we are. This means power at its deepest level isn't controlling your choices, it's shaping who makes those choices. The you that emerges from a controlling relationship is fundamentally different from the you that would have emerged from a healthy one. Not because you've been damaged, but because you've been constructed differently. The self isn't discovered, it's authored. And the question becomes, who's holding the pen? The third synthesis connects individual and collective patterns. We've seen how seismogenesis creates escalating complementary patterns between people, how spiral of silence makes minority opinions disappear even when they are not minority, how drama triangles perpetuate dysfunction through rotating roles. These aren't separate from the individual techniques, they're what happens when individual mechanisms interact and compound. The strategic ambiguity that keeps one person off balance combines with the information asymmetry that another person maintains, intersects with the manufactured consensus of third-person projects, until you have entire systems where everyone's confused, no one has complete information, and dissent seems impossible. Power isn't just individual relationships, it's the emergent property of these techniques operating simultaneously across networks of relationships. You're not dealing with a controller, you're embedded in an ecosystem of control. The fourth synthesis addresses why these patterns persist even when recognized. We explored change-back attacks, how systems resist the healthy change of any component. We saw ethical fading, how good people gradually accommodate harm through incremental compromise. We understood systems justification, why people defend structures that harm them. What connects these is that power creates its own stability. The longer it operates, the more invested everyone becomes in maintaining it. The more you've sacrificed to prove loyalty, the harder walking away becomes. The more you've accommodated to keep peace, the more intolerable peace-breaking appears. The more you've justified the system, the more threatening evidence of injustice becomes. Power doesn't just establish itself, it creates the conditions for its own perpetuation. By the time you fully recognize it, you're already woven into it, and extracting yourself requires unraveling part of who you've become. Here's the fifth synthesis, perhaps the darkest. These mechanisms are morally neutral. Fire can warm you or burn you. The same techniques that manipulate can educate. Strategic silence can be manipulation or boundary setting. Controlled vulnerability can be exploitation or genuine sharing. Intermittent reinforcement can create toxic dependency or healthy spontaneity. The difference isn't in the technique, it's in the intent and the impact. This means knowledge of these patterns is power, but power without ethics is simply capability. Understanding control doesn't make you immune to exercising it. In fact, understanding might make you more capable of it. The question isn't whether you know these patterns. It's what you do with that knowledge. The sixth synthesis reveals the observer's dilemma. Once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. Every interaction becomes potentially analyzable. Is that person strategically mirroring me or genuinely connecting? Is this intermittent reinforcement or just natural variation? Is that gaslighting or honest disagreement about memory? The knowledge that was supposed to protect you can become a cage of its own. Hypervigilance, inability to trust, seeing manipulation everywhere even when it's not there. The research on complex PTSD and hyperarousal shows that learning to detect threat can make you detect threat everywhere. The antidote to manipulation isn't paranoia. But distinguishing healthy skepticism from corrosive suspicion requires wisdom that knowledge alone doesn't provide. The seventh synthesis connects to collective responsibility. We saw distributed responsibility, how harm diffuses across enough people that no one feels accountable. We explored bystander effects, how the presence of others makes individual action less likely. We understood pluralistic ignorance, how false consensus maintains norms nobody wants. What emerges is uncomfortable. We're all participants in control systems, even when we're not controllers. Your silence enables someone else's domination. Your accommodation maintains someone else's dysfunction. Your unwillingness to challenge normalized harm makes you part of the structure perpetuating it. This isn't about guilt, it's about recognizing that power isn't just something individuals wield. It's something systems distribute, and we're all nodes in those systems. The question isn't whether you participate in structures of power. You do, simply by existing in relationship with others. The question is whether you participate consciously or unconsciously, whether you resist or reinforce, whether you replicate or interrupt. The eighth synthesis addresses the paradox of freedom. We've explored learned helplessness, where repeated powerlessness creates passivity even when circumstances change. We've seen reactance, where threatened freedom triggers desperate reassertion. We've understood that humans crave autonomy but also crave relief from the burden of choice. What emerges is that freedom isn't a state you achieve, it's a tension you navigate. Too little autonomy and you're controlled. Too much and you're overwhelmed. The freest people aren't those who've escaped all constraint, they're those who've chosen their constraints consciously. Who've decided which authorities to trust, which boundaries to accept, which dependencies to embrace. The opposite of control isn't total independence, it's conscious interdependence. It's knowing you're influenced and choosing your influences. It's recognizing you're shaped by relationships and being deliberate about which relationships you allow to shape you. The ninth synthesis examines the role of awareness itself. We discussed how self-awareness doesn't grant immunity, knowing about cognitive biases doesn't make you immune to them. Recognizing manipulation doesn't automatically protect you from it. But awareness does something else, it creates space. Space between stimulus and response. Space between automatic reaction and conscious choice. Space between what you're feeling and what you do about it. That space is where freedom lives, not in being unaffected by influence, but in having a moment to decide how you respond to it. The research on mindfulness and metacognition shows that this space can be cultivated, expanded, strengthened. Not through denying emotion or suppressing reaction, but through observing them without immediately acting on them. The person who has this space isn't immune to control, they're just less automatic in their response to it. The 10th and final synthesis brings us full circle. Power is, ultimately, about the story. The story about who you are, what happened, what's possible, what's normal, what's deserved. Every technique we've explored is a method of storytelling, framing the narrative, editing the script, casting the roles, controlling the plot. The person who controls the story controls reality, because humans don't experience raw reality. We experience interpreted reality, reality filtered through narrative. This is why gaslighting is so devastating. It attacks the story you tell about your own experience. Why isolation is so effective. It eliminates alternative narrators. Why manufactured consensus is so powerful. It makes one story seem like the only story. The ultimate power isn't physical force or even emotional manipulation. It's narrative authority, being the one whose version of events is accepted as truth. So we return to that moment we began with, the shift of power in a conversation. We now understand that moment completely. It's the accumulation of body language and silence and framing and emotional manipulation and identity construction and reality management and narrative control. It's individual technique and systemic pattern. It's conscious strategy and unconscious habit. It's ancient evolutionary wiring meeting modern social complexity. But here's what else we understand now. That moment isn't inevitable. It's not fate or force of nature. It's human interaction, which means it's subject to human choice. Not easy choice. Power perpetuates itself, resists change, attacks those who challenge it. But possible choice. The architecture of power is vast, complex, sophisticated. But architecture built can be architecture dismantled. Stories told can be stories retold. Patterns recognized can be patterns interrupted. Not perfectly. Not easily. Not without cost. But possibly. And possibility, in the end, is what all of this knowledge is for. Not to make you paranoid or cynical or manipulative yourself, but to make you conscious. To give you choice where there was only reaction. To show you the cage so you can see the door. The machinery of control is everywhere, operating constantly, shaping everything. But you're no longer blind to it. You're no longer purely subject to it. You understand how power works. And understanding, imperfect as it is the first step toward freedom.